I'm not an academic scholar. I'm something of a recent practitioner in government. I've worked in and around government for around 15 years, and most recently in number 10 Downing Street. I left government last year, and when I left, I spent quite a lot of time thinking about a paradox in Britain today, which is that as a country, we've never been so well educated. We've never had so many people going to university. We're a magnet for global talent in many different sectors, in finance, in tech, in the creative arts, in law, you name it. And yet, despite having such a high stock of human capital, our political class seems more inadequate and ineffective than ever. Generally, when you look throughout history, the increase in the average level of intelligence of a country will lead to an increase in the sophistication of the political leadership. And it seems, for some strange reason, that in Britain, and I would argue perhaps in, I can see this talk may resonate in other countries as well, but it seems that we're living through a moment where there's been a divergence between the general intelligence and the political elite. Like I say, I've worked in government, so I don't say this in a flippant and just a comical way. And in Britain, there's something of a national sport where armchair critics, opinion writers, columnists, perhaps some of you in this room, have a tendency to mock politicians and the people who run government. So I recognise that there's something of a comedic element in this, but there is also something serious, I think, going on. And I recognise that many of my former colleagues working in government, you've heard a couple of them in this conference, many talented individuals actually do work in government. But I think it's fair to say that there is a problem in the wider system of public leadership in the UK. And this is something that's been widely acknowledged by people across the political spectrum. The quality of decision-making in public institutions and in government can often be quite poor. There can sometimes be an inability to think long-term. There is sometimes a lack of institutional memory and of policy knowledge, both domestic and foreign policy knowledge amongst legislators, parliamentarians. And there's often a failure amongst political parties to be able to communicate or even articulate a vision that can cohere people and bring people along. And the result of these problems is an overall decline in public trust in government and a growing cynicism about what government can do to improve people's lives. As I say, many commentators have noted this phenomenon. At the beginning of this conference, Henry Kissinger was cited from his latest book on leadership, and he suggests in his final chapter of that book that it's almost impossible for great world leaders to emerge today for various reasons: the rise of social media, the lack of deep literacy, the changing education system in many developed nations. But I would like to talk a bit about what I think is happening in the UK and some factors that I think are specific to our system. And then perhaps, hopefully, if I have some time at the end, I might suggest one or two solutions. So in the UK context, the first thing that most people would point to is that there are some fairly clear structural reasons why our political leadership seems to be failing. And the first is that what economists would call a classic misallocation of capital problem. If you're a young person in your 20s, you don't want to go and work in politics or government because it's relatively poorly paid and seen as increasingly low status. So a smart young person in their 20s will go into business or the professions, or perhaps even go and work in an NGO where they can gain the esteem of their peers and be able to build a career. And that then creates a doom loop effect. If fewer good people go into politics, it makes it less good, less attractive, and then even fewer people want to join that group. The drain of talent away from public life is happening despite the fact that actually there's more interest in politics and political education than ever. So UK universities have more and more courses now for undergraduates and postgraduates in politics, public policy. But many of the graduates of those courses will actually go on into the private sector or the non-governmental sector. And that's the same, in fact, of the Oxford PPE course, which is famous in Britain for being something of a talent pipeline for future prime ministers. But the majority of people on that course won't go into the civil service, and only a small number will eventually go into frontline politics. Also, the most prestigious institutions in the UK that teach political education don't actually teach the majority students from the UK. So the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford, which is one of the most prestigious schools now for public policy in the world. It was set up to be a UK equivalent of the Kennedy School in Harvard. About 80 to 90% of the cohort for their Masters in Public Policy is actually from abroad. And the LSE is another very prestigious university for teaching public policy. 70% of the student body at the LSE is foreign-born. Now, these are fantastic institutions, and it's excellent that they attract so many students from around the world. But the UK is very good at educating the world's leaders, but I think less concerned or less focused on educating perhaps the UK's own leaders. So the bigger question for me is, why has this state of affairs been allowed to continue? Why have we been so supremely relaxed about these structural factors? All successful societies throughout history have given much thought to the question of what I would call elite formation. Just as any family or business might do succession planning, societies have found ways to identify talented people to lead, and found ways to educate them and prepare them for the challenges ahead. Probably the most famous story in biblical times of succession planning is Moses handing over to Joshua. God says to Moses, you can reach the promised land, but you're not allowed to enter. You'll die before you go in. And Moses, in a state of anxiety, has to find a new leader. And God tells him to choose Joshua, who has effectively been apprenticed to him for about 40 years. As Adrian Wooldridge documents in his excellent book, The Aristocracy of Talent, different societies have found different ways and created different institutions to go and find smart, intelligent, and motivated people to run their countries. In Imperial China, in around 600, they introduced a national written exam, which any male in the country could enter. It was very, very competitive, very rigorous, and if you passed, you then had entry into the life of a bureaucrat, which was high status and relatively high paid. In more modern times, European nations and latterly America and other developed countries have created universities, grammar schools, public schools, again, to find intelligent, talented people and to prepare them both with the knowledge and the expertise to run countries, but also the character and the values and the ethics of being great leaders. It's something of a cliche in Britain that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Eton. This idea that education and training and preparation was an important part of these institutions' purpose. So what's happened in Britain to the idea of elite formation? I'd suggest that something profound shifted in the culture, and this is me speculating rather than using data and evidence, but I speculate that in around the 80s and 90s, there was a shift in the idea of elite formation, and fundamentally, institutions and the elite themselves started to become more democratic and egalitarian, which is a very good thing, less focused on class difference. But with that went away the idea of the noblesse oblige, the aristocratic kind of elite that had a sense of their role, their responsibility for being custodians of the nation. Instead, the new elite were talented individuals with careers to pursue and families to look after. And that sense of being, having some duty to the nation, I think has faded away. Around the same time, universities also changed their funding models. They were no longer taking funding from central government, but forced to take funding through a tuition fee model. So they started to think of themselves as providers of a product to consumers. And of course, over time, they weren't thinking just about students in the UK, but about global consumers, foreign, international students, and therefore started to think of themselves as powerhouses of global talent. Again, fantastic for those institutions, fantastic for research and for cultural exchange and all those good things. But what's happened, I think, is that in those changes, we have lost the sense of who is responsible for training a future elite, who's in charge of that job. Another change, which I think is sometimes overlooked, is the fact that political parties themselves have stopped thinking about their talent pipeline. So political parties used to be, in the UK, mass membership organisations. In the 1950s, around 1 in 10 people in the UK would have been members of a political party, about 5 million people. It's now a tenth of that size. So political party membership has shrunk. And political parties themselves no longer provide political education. People in Britain are often surprised when I tell them that both the Conservative and the Labour Party had colleges, and they produced pamphlets and leaflets about political philosophy and economics, and people would travel to these colleges and hear lectures and meet people from other parts of the country. There was a vast social network that was dedicated to training activists and training people in political thought, and all that has basically fallen away. As a result, many of the people who come into politics now don't receive really any kind of political education unless you've done a degree in PPE, and we should remember that really only a minority do. Most of the people who come into Parliament haven't had really any grounding in public policy or economics or political philosophy or any of the things we've been hearing about over the last 2 or 3 days. They're expected to sort of pick it up for themselves, figure out for themselves what they believe and what they understand of the world. Meanwhile, the civil service, which is non-elected, these are the officials in government, their most prestigious national institution, Sunningdale College, was closed down in 2012. So the one institution that was designed to train civil servants in areas of knowledge and expertise also was closed down. There have been attempts in recent years to try and resurrect something of that training, but it's been very difficult. And perhaps most damaging of all, I would argue, is that the very idea of meritocracy, the importance of recruiting the best, the most excellent people, has itself become quite unfashionable. So if you look at the website for civil service recruitment in Britain, there's a lot of emphasis on inclusion and representation and diversity, but compare that to the Singaporean civil service website, which uses the word excellence. That's not a word that you see very often when we talk about the civil service in Britain. It's almost a boo word. It's a word that seems something that perhaps we're slightly embarrassed about. Why did we stop caring? Why do we allow this lack of training and preparation to continue? I would argue that in the last 2 decades, probably longer, there has been a kind of complacency in Britain and perhaps in other developed nation states about how hard it is to protect a nation state, how fragile and how vulnerable our situation is. I think that an elite believed that we were living through the end of history, we were living through the end of boom and bust, that we were in a period of relative stability and security. And therefore, finding the best people wasn't so urgent. It wasn't as much of a necessity. We could have the luxury of creating a more diverse and inclusive political class and not worry so much if they weren't up to the job. I don't think people thought this explicitly or said it explicitly, but I think there was a kind of a sense that we could all relax because it almost didn't matter too much if we didn't have the best people running the country, because frankly, the country can run itself. And as we've heard in the last few days, we're now much more aware of the kind of existential threats that we do face and the kinds of vulnerabilities that we do have. In fact, the countries that have the best elite formation, that I think invest most in talent and in preparation of the political elite, Singapore and Israel, it's not a coincidence that they are countries that are very, very aware, and from the start of their independence were very aware of threats on their doorstep, and have therefore judged elite formation to be very important.
Can you make it?
I certainly can, possibly even less time. So what can be done? What must be done, as Lenin would say? I would argue first that we must treat elite formation again as something to consciously strive for, to consciously rediscover in our best institutions. And that means universities, the civil service, other public institutions give much greater thought to the idea that they are responsible for finding the best people and for training them. Of course, trying to find the best people from the largest pool of talent and not through some narrow elitist pipeline in the old-fashioned sense, but certainly trying to attract good people into those worlds again. And there are many other specific policy prescriptions I could make, but I don't think I would have time. And the second is, I think that as in previous eras, as previous societies have done, I think we need new institutions and new experiments to develop elite statecraft. And if I can use my final minute to give a plug, a shameless plug for a new organisation that I set up called Civic Future, civicfuture.org, if you want to look us up. We're not for profit, and we're in the business of finding good people to go into public life, people who come from other sectors, other professions, who are very motivated to serve but currently don't know how to go into politics, or who haven't gone through the standard civil service recruitment process. And we believe that it's important to teach political philosophy and history, and also to prepare people for the challenges ahead. We've heard about AI in this conference. Obviously, we've talked a lot about geopolitics. The importance of preparing people in understanding the world as it is today, so that they're better able to make decisions about the future. And crucially, as part of that education, to build the network again, to build the human relationships that used to exist through which we transmitted political education and learning. So if you're interested in hearing more about that, please come and talk to me afterwards, but I will leave it there, I think. Thank you.
Are universities focusing on sort of the wrong kind of training? I'm a little tempted to paraphrase T.S. Eliot. Where is the statecraft lost in public policy? Where is the public policy that was lost at 10 Downing Street? Say more and more enroll in political subjects at universities, but is the focus wrong?
So others can comment better than me on the content of these courses. I think lots of the politics courses focus a lot on polling and data analysis for obvious reasons. People who work in public affairs and so on will find those skills very useful. And this is it would be a crude generalization to say they're all focusing on the wrong things, but there's certainly an emphasis more on what I would call the kind of technocratic aspects of politics. But I think it's more about the broader question, the broader culture, and why it is that many people from other fields who might study science subjects or study the creative arts, that perhaps in the past those people would have felt that there was a route for them to engage in politics, and that has changed a great deal. So whilst I think that there's much that could be fixed in the university education in politics, I think it's a broader problem as well.
Yeah. Another problem, at least in Sweden, is that politicians are becoming a breed of their own. Could it become sort of more open so that you could go into politics later in life with all the outside experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. And in my experience, I've met lots of people in their 40s, 50s, 60s who always thought that they would go into public life in some way, and then realized that they haven't engaged or been part of a political network, and actually they don't know how to do it. We often complain in Britain that not enough people come from outside the law or outside Westminster, and yet we haven't, as a country, really created the networks or the channels by which people can come in from those fields. So I think that's a big problem for us.
You said that Singapore and Israel are excellent. What about France, who has this ENR breeding their famous enarchs?
Well, I'm wise enough not to start talking about other people, other countries' institutions. There may be others in the audience who can comment. These are all very prestigious public policy organizations. Obviously, the Kennedy School I mentioned. But it is noticeable how the ones, certainly in the UK, they do not necessarily lead to people then going on into frontline politics. But it's not to say that they aren't excellent institutions. They do a very good job in many ways. But when I set up Civic Future, I wanted a curriculum that both taught about the practical, technical aspects of policy making, but also tied it back to history and political philosophy and questions of geopolitics. That sense of the breadth of what a political life entails, and the kind of knowledge that Kissinger talks about in his book. I think that doesn't really exist in the kinds of curricula you see. That universities have become more and more specialised in their approach. And I think that there is a need for a general education that allows people, not just in the space of 1 or 2 years, but over a lifetime. And many of the statesmen and stateswomen we've heard about in this conference came into politics relatively late or became great leaders in their 60s and 70s. We now ask MPs to do the job in their 20s and 30s. It should be a lifetime of preparation.
Thank you very much.